Hi, I would like to share a very recent story with you, which provides an example of how to explain the research evidence to a client or a family member of a client that is really at odds with what they want to do and what their beliefs are. Let me tell you about Sandra, a mother who contacted me about her daughter Evie. I'm obviously not using real names, and I have the permission of Sandra to tell you this story in a way that's non-identifiable. So Sandra found out about me. She's from another state. I believe she did a Google search and she found my name as a speech pathologist who was a researcher and someone who taught and worked clinically in uh, AAC, Augmentative and Alternative Communication, and working with children with complex communication needs. Sandra's in a situation where she's working really hard and is feeling quite stressed because she is wanting the National Disability Insurance Scheme, the NDIS, to provide funding within the individualised package for her daughter to include an Auslan tutor. Evie has autism, intellectual disability, and has also been given a diagnosis of severe motor speech dyspraxia. I've never met Evie, and so the information I gave Sandra was really based on my knowledge of complex communication needs and the research evidence, and also my understanding of what supports language development, both in typical development and children with disability. So I talked with Sandra about why she wanted an Auslan tutor, and she told me that Evie responded very well to signs, and she'd been using keyword signs with her daughter. Now, if you don't know about keyword signs, we can talk more about that in class, or you can read about it, or you'll learn about it through your other subjects. But it's basically providing models in spoken English, but signing each of the keywords in the sentence according to English word order. So I might sign ball, kick the ball, where I'm saying the whole sentence. So I'm saying, Evie, go and kick the ball, rather than all the grammatical word markers, etc. Auslan is a different language. It doesn't follow English word order. So I said to the mother, all right, so the issue that we have with this is, firstly, there is no research support to support the use of Auslan as a means of teaching a child who is not using speech to use language. There just isn't any research in that area. Well, very little, I found out, because I did do some research to find out if I was actually giving her an accurate picture. And the main reason for this is Auslan tends to be limited to the deaf community. So if we teach children with intellectual disability or autism to use Auslan, there is no community of Auslan signers that they would have ready access to. However, this mother had thought about these issues, and she'd actually introduced her child to an Auslan community. And in doing so, she'd actually met a couple of young adults who also had complex communication needs, one with cerebral palsy, and I think one with intellectual disability, though I'm not sure. And they had decided that they preferred to use Auslan because speech was quite difficult for them. So we have this situation where, for whatever reason, speech is not an accessible modality. So AAC is another means by which they can express their communication. But it also provides support for their language development, which is really key. And that's what this mother wanted. She wanted to support her child's language development. So moving from single words to word combinations to grammatical structures that would enable her to develop that strong foundation required for lifelong learning, and in particular in school and for reading instruction. But as I said, it's a language that doesn't follow English word order. So I explained how the research evidence didn't support this, but I did qualify the statement by saying it's not that the research has been done and found that it is not a good practice, in that it's not effective in helping to expand children's language. It's just that the research has not been done, and that's a very different scenario. So I used my evidence-based practice principles, and I thought, right, if I formulate a question that cannot be addressed directly from the research literature, for example, does Auslan result in language development when taught to a child with a language delay that results from having intellectual disability and autism? If I can't find research to answer that question, then I kind of have to drop back a little bit, and I have to search for research that addresses sign and language development or language and learning in children with disability. I did manage to find one study which had compared American Sign Language, which is the American Auslan, if you like, follows its own word order. It compared American Sign Language with signed speech, or keyword signs, but certainly following English word order, with speech only. And it was a single case design. And in fact, it found that both sign conditions were better than speech only for a child not with intellectual disability or autism, but with a significant language delay. So we've got a different participant group, and the intervention includes a version of deaf sign, the American version. Now, when you compared the signed English with the American Sign Language, signed English was a little better, but not a whole lot better than American Sign Language. But for American Sign Language, there was less variability. It's kind of an interesting result. So there was evidence that it was better than speech alone, but not better than keyword signing. So anyway, I also looked at the research, and there's quite a robust evidence base that shows that there are particular strategies that we use to support the language development of children with language delays, whether it's a language impairment that's specific, or as a result of an intellectual disability, or through autism, or whatever cause. And we know that there are some very effective strategies that are used, such as providing models that follow the child's lead, such as providing a visual or a verbal prompt, such as expanding on what the child said. So if the child uses one word, we provide a model that's expanded. So what I ended up sending Sandra to help support her argument is a series of statements based on what we know from the research evidence. So first of all, we know that spoken language or speech relies on the interaction of your cognitive skills, your language skills, which is related to your cognitive skills, and also your motor skills. So you have to get all those working together in order to be able to speak. And for children with particular or various types of disabilities, that often doesn't come together. So for whatever reason, it means that speech is not an accessible modality to them. So for those children, we will often use some form of AAC, whether it's signs or an aided system, to provide them with a means by which they can learn and demonstrate their language learning. It's the modality with which they express their language. And we know that that's an effective strategy. We have lots of research support. Okay, but what does that research support look like? Well, and the second step in that, and relating to typical language development, is that we know we have to provide the child with a means of communicating that is at a critical time in their development. So certainly within the first 2 years, preferably by 12 months, we need to provide them with that strong support. So access to an alternate modality, as well as good language learning strategies for them. And if they miss that critical time, then they're just going to face increasing deficits in their development. Most of the research, though, into the use of AAC with children with developmental disabilities of autism and intellectual disability has focused on single words. For whatever reason, it tends to be the easiest thing to teach. And certainly Shane and I reviewed the research with our colleague David Trembath on the use of aided systems for children with autism, and found that there was just a plethora of studies. In fact, so many studies. We managed to do a review of the reviews and found that, yeah, AAC is really effective with children with autism for teaching pretty well single words and mostly requests. But the research hasn't extended much beyond that. All right, so where does that leave us? Okay, it leaves us with an evidence base that says AAC is effective, but the focus is on aided communication and on keyword sign. But we don't have research that tells us about putting a child into a much richer language environment, except for a couple of studies I happened to do a number of years ago, where I actually used aided AAC and sign language to move children with intellectual disabilities from a single word stage to a 2-word stage. And so based on that research, what I suggested was that if we combine the research that we have into extending language beyond using single words, both in the literature that relates to AAC and in spoken language intervention, we can apply some really effective strategies. There is no reason to believe, or there is no contraindication, that you can't do that within an Auslan environment, even though we don't have direct research on that. So Auslan is a form of AAC, and it is a language in its own right. So it makes sense that you could apply those principles of using those language intervention strategies within Auslan. However, because we don't have research, what we need to be very careful about is to keep good data, because we want to make sure, at least I do, if I'm recommending that, yes, if I pull on research in quite highly related areas, I can make a pretty good argument for why it's quite possible that if this mother, with some support from a speech pathologist and with an Auslan tutor, can provide those models or those strategies within Auslan, then this child, who is already responding quite well to AAC, could well, in fact, expand her language and become a competent language user. But we have to keep data. And the responsibility of someone like myself and of clinicians is to document that progress. And I'm hoping that maybe Sandra and I can continue to work on this, and I may end up being an expert witness, I don't know. But either way, that we can actually share the outcomes of this journey that Sandra is taking with her daughter Evie.